Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dario Health. Manage your blood glucose levels. Increase your possibilities. By Gvoke HypoPen, the first premixed auto-injector for very low blood sugar. And by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
This week, the first treatment to prevent type 1 diabetes for any length of time is in front of the FDA right now. We're going to talk about the clinical stuff, but there's a lot of emotion wrapped up in this development as well.
I was trained to make people who have type 1 diabetes feel that they're never doing a good enough job, that they're at risk of developing all these complications. And, you know, when you get to the point in your career, you realize that not only did that not help, it hurts. And then really being in a position to hopefully be able to make a fundamental difference in how that goes down, it's really hard to articulate, I have to say.
That's Dr. Henry Anhalt of Provention, the company behind Teplizumab. He's also a pediatric endocrinologist. We'll talk about Teplizumab, what is in front of the FDA, and why this treatment is so promising. In Innovations, a roundtable on insulin pricing with Congresswoman Katie Porter. Didn't have a whiteboard, as she's very famous for, but pulled no punches. You're going to want to hear this. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I am always so glad to have you here. As you know, we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I'm your host, Stacey Simms. My son, Benny, was diagnosed with type 1 right before he turned 2 back in 2006. My husband lives with type 2 diabetes. I don't have diabetes, but I have a background in broadcasting, and that is how you get the podcast. We are coming up on year 6 of this show, and I got to tell you, I don't get too excited about breakthroughs or treatments anymore because we've covered a lot of stuff that frankly hasn't panned out the way we had all hoped. But this is a little bit different because Teplizumab is a drug that has already been shown to prevent type 1 diabetes for 3 years. And for some people, they are coming up on 4 years. What does that mean? How do we know it's preventing it? Why is it so exciting? And, could this mean a breakthrough for everyone with type 1? There's a lot to unpack here, so we'll get to that in just a little bit. But we've talked about Teplizumab before with the folks from TrialNet. I'll link up those previous episodes at diabetes-connections.com. There's always an episode homepage for each and every episode, which more recently will have the transcription, but for every episode has important links and more information for you. Quick heads up, if you are listening as this episode goes live tonight, Tuesday, I will be with JDRF with a couple of chapters, or maybe it's just one chapter now. Things have moved around a lot for JDRF. But I'll be with the Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico chapters tonight, talking about the world's worst diabetes mom. We're going to have a fun discussion about the book. And if you are in one of those chapters, you're going to get the paperback for free. If you're not in one of those chapters, come along anyway. I've got some audiobooks to give away. It is always just fun to talk to you. I'll be reading from the book, but having a discussion as well. Type 1 talk, it's different times because of the different states and because of where I am. So it's 5:30 in Nevada and Arizona and 6:30 in New Mexico. It will be 8:30 here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I may be in my pajamas, but I hope you can join me for that. And again, I'll put a link, and I've got that out on my social. I've been talking about that on social media for a couple of days. I've mentioned a couple of times this year that we're focusing on technology. And a lot of that is because 2021 is going to see a lot of FDA approvals. Things have been backed up because of COVID. So this year and next year, I think we're going to see many things kind of bunched up. But some of that technology isn't mechanical, right? It's medical, or what we would think of more as biological, perhaps. And that's what we're talking about today. So we will get to Teplizumab in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dario Health. And over the years, I find we manage diabetes better when we're thinking less about all the stuff of diabetes tasks. That's why I love partnering with people who take the load off on things like ordering supplies, so I can really just focus on Benny. The Dario Diabetes Success Plan is all about you. All the strips and lancets you need delivered to your door, one-on-one coaching so you can meet your milestones, weekly insights into your trends with suggestions on how to succeed. Get the diabetes management plan that works with you and for you. Dario's published studies demonstrate high-impact clinical results. To find out more, go to mydario.com/diabetes-connections. My guest this week is the Executive Director of Medical Affairs for Provention Bio. He is also a pediatric endocrinologist, and Dr. Henry Anhalt is also very involved with Camp Najeta. He's on the board there. I believe he was the medical director at one point, but we have spoken to Dr. Anhalt before in that capacity. My cousin goes to camp there, or he did growing up. I will link back on our episode about camp with Dr. Anhalt because it's a really good one. And especially if you're thinking about diabetes camp, if your local camp is happening this summer in person, that's a good one to listen to as well. Provention is a biopharmaceutical company dedicated to autoimmune disease, and they are applying for what's called a biologics license application for Teplizumab for the delay or prevention of type 1 diabetes in at-risk individuals. That is in front of the FDA right now. There is a goal date here that the FDA has assigned them of July 2nd. So we shall see what happens between now and then. But there is an awful lot to talk about and explain. Here is my discussion with Dr. Henry Anhalt. Dr. Anhalt, thank you so much for joining me, and welcome back to Diabetes Connections. It's good to talk to you again.
Likewise, Stacey. It's a delight to be back with you again.
Well, I'm so interested in this news, which, it's hard to get excited after all this time for me, but this is exciting news. But let's kind of set the stage, if I could. Talk to me a little bit to just start off here. My listeners are familiar with T1 Detect, the program that JDRF came on the show and talked about in late December about a new screening initiative. And Provention is the company that is, I guess, doing the heavy lifting here and doing the work to screen people. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of this project?
Well, Stacey, the first thing I wanted to do is to point out that in addition to the T1 Detect program, we have the type1tested.com website, which will also give people who are going to that website additional information about screening. It's important that we take a shift in how it is that we look at type 1 diabetes. And as we all know, mostly everyone's experience, and certainly that's been the case with my patients as a pediatric endocrinologist, they present and they come to attention when they've been having symptoms, when they're not feeling well, when they are noticed to be losing weight, and a parent says, gee, something's wrong, and they go to a doctor and oftentimes are going from one doctor to another until, unfortunately, kids and adults are getting sicker and sicker and then ultimately end up in an ICU setting. That's what we used to think about as type 1 diabetes. But we now know that type 1 diabetes is really in 3 stages. We know it's an autoimmune disease, but the 3 stages are really important to highlight because the first stage is when someone has 2 antibodies that are directed at the pancreas. And those 2 antibodies are amongst a number of antibodies. But if you have 2 or more, you have stage 1 diabetes, even in the absence of having any symptoms or abnormal blood sugars. And we'll come back to that in just a second. Stage 2 is when you have those antibodies or more, and you have some abnormal blood sugars, but not high enough to either have symptoms or for anybody to even recognize. And then stage 3 is, as I mentioned a moment ago, when typically people have symptoms and they end up sick, unfortunately, and seeking medical attention. We won't know whether or not someone is in stage 1, stage 2, or stage 3 unless they do things like you just suggested and participate in the T1 Detect program or have their antibodies tested so that they can identify and understand where they are along that continuum. And so we now classify type 1 diabetes as soon as you have 2 or more antibodies, but even in the absence of having abnormal blood sugar. So why is this important? Because as therapies become more and more available, and we know that there are a whole bunch that are now coming along Some of them are pending approval. So, for example, Teplizumab, which is before the FDA right now. And we hope that the FDA will look at the body of evidence and the safety and the efficacy. And we currently are targeted to have an approval date in the first week of July. But it's also important to realize that there are lots of other medications that are soon to follow that may also be of use to people who are along this continuum. For us and for the people that we care about in the type 1 community, the ability for a drug like Teplizumab, provided that the FDA looks at the data and says, yep, we believe it's safe and effective, can prevent people from progressing from stage 2 to stage 3. Without that, we won't know who would be a good candidate for that kind of intervention.
I always get a little confused, and I know that for somebody like me who's a layperson, it seems like we're early on in the research. But the question I always have about the antibodies is, I remember years ago with TrialNet, and they would say things to us like, well, years ago for me when I was learning about TrialNet, they would explain it like, well, kids usually get tested more often than adults because things can change with children. If somebody has the antibodies, do they always develop the symptoms of type 1 diabetes? Or do we not know that yet?
The uptake of testing or the routine screening for people at risk has not been adopted widely. And that's important to highlight. And that's why the JDRF is in the middle of this educational campaign, is because the fact is that for all intents and purposes, our colleagues, the pediatric endocrinologists, adult endocrinologists, are not thinking about getting antibodies. And certainly in children who you would expect are at greatest risk, those who have a first-degree relative with type 1 diabetes, a sibling or a parent where we know that their risk of developing type 1 diabetes is 15-fold greater than the general population, that it would be more widely adopted. But that's unfortunately not the case. And in adults, to your point, people don't think about it. So one of the challenges with adults who ultimately develop type 1 diabetes is that the family practice docs or the endocrinologists who maybe are not involved, likely not to be involved because they aren't seeing people who are adults who develop diabetes until their 50s or maybe their 40s, and they're not thinking about type 1 diabetes. The greater challenge with adults is around the assumption that if you're in your third decade or fourth decade of life, that you do not have type 1 diabetes. But we know that that's not the case because people into their 50s and 60s are developing type 1 diabetes and are continuing to make insulin, but unquestionably have type 1 diabetes.
I'm curious, when T1 Detect was announced, a lot of people in the diabetes community thought, and I agree with them, it was so interesting. It was such a great idea. Like, let's get more screening. Let's get more screening. But when I talked to JDRF, they said, no, we want everybody in the diabetes community, but we want people outside the diabetes community to start thinking about this. What can be done to try to push this message into families that, don't think that they have to worry about diabetes? How are you all doing that?
Yeah, what I really focus on, Stacey, is the folks who are at risk.
Okay.
And those are the ones with first-degree relatives, because we know we have data from global programs where they're doing population screening. They're screening everybody, not only second and third degree relatives of people who have type 1 or even first degree relatives. They're screening entire populations. And that's terrific within the context, at least right now, of research programs that are well funded. But we're facing a battle ahead of us as we get people to adopt and we get the payers and the payer community to recognize the importance, which is part of the educational effort. However, we really need to focus right now for the here and now, because that's achievable, attainable, and the therapeutic agents that are either before the agency now or that are coming are the ones that are going to be the most likely to benefit. And that's why I think right now at risk is the most important population to look at.
Got it. let's talk about what's in front of the FDA. I remember a couple of years ago trying to pronounce Teplizumab and then getting really, I know, but getting really excited as it seemed to, and please fill us in, but it looked like the research was showing this is preventing that movement, as you said, from stage 2 to stage 3. So people have the antibodies that show that they have type 1 diabetes, but it kept them from progressing to showing symptoms for 2 years. And then it looked like 3 years recently. Am I getting all that right? Right back to Dr. Anhalt in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Gvoke HypoPen. And almost everyone who takes insulin has experienced a low blood sugar. That can be scary. A very low blood sugar is really scary. And that's where Gvoke HypoPen comes in. It's the first auto-injector to treat very low blood sugar. Gvoke HypoPen is pre-mixed and ready to go with no visible needle. That means it's easy to use. In usability studies, 99% of people were able to give Gvoke correctly. I'm so glad to have something different. Find out more. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Gvoke logo. Gvoke shouldn't be used in patients with pheochromocytoma or insulinoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk. Now back to Dr. Anhalt. And I had just asked him if I was kind of getting it right, that Teplizumab had delayed the onset of type 1 in people for up to 3 years.
You're getting that spot on, Stacey. And I think that here it's important to stress that how do we know that they're actually having this delay? Are there any markers that we can look at? And C-peptide is the key, because for the listeners, it's important to highlight that this molecule or this protein, C-peptide, is a measure of how much function your beta cells have, how much of your actual insulin is being produced. And the studies have shown, and the authors concluded, that in fact, those treated with Teplizumab had stabilization of their C-peptide production, and in some cases actually improved C-peptide, confirming that the beta cell function is being preserved and suggesting, I may add, that beta cell function is being restored. So it wasn't only this delay, but it was a delay that was marked by a direct measurable compound or protein that indicates beta cell health and beta cell function.
When we talk about Teplizumab, what is that? I assume it's more than, a pill that you would take once and never have to do again. Is it a treatment? How do people take it?
So Teplizumab, and I had a really hard time pronouncing that. I started working at Provention Bio in December, and I'm finally getting around to pronouncing it right. And it wasn't only now, actually, that I heard about Teplizumab. When I was working back in 2008 at a hospital in New Jersey, there were these clinical trials ongoing with Teplizumab. And at the time, I became really familiar and saw what the potential that this drug had. But to answer your question directly, Teplizumab is administered by IV infusion over a period, at least in the trials, over a period of 14 days as one single infusion. So that's the way that the trial that we're talking about, the data that we're discussing, that trial had a 14-day single infusion. So IV infusion every day for 14 days straight. That was the data that we talked about, was the outcome of that trial. Ultimately, though, the FDA will make the decision of, based on the data that exists, how many days of infusion, et cetera.
Got it. But to be clear, when we're saying it's 3 years later, those people that they're measuring 3 years later it's still from those first and only 2 weeks?
That is correct. So people had a 2-week infusion, and this population was followed out for quite some time. Actually, the recruitment took 7 years, wow. But this population has continued. And when you have this rolling admission into a trial, it becomes a little bit difficult to characterize, but suffice it to say, based on the appropriate data analysis, that's the conclusion that the authors came to, and obviously incredibly encouraged by those results. So with the follow-up time that we have, nearly a year later, it shows now approximately 3 years.
I may be jumping to conclusions, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sitting here thinking, if my son Benny had gotten something like this at 23 months, and we could have delayed the onset of type 1 diabetes until he almost went to kindergarten, like that to me, I know that there's more implications down the road, but just the idea that he would be able to communicate a little bit better, right, with me, maybe he could pronounce diabetes. There would be some other things that we could have, some really difficult stages that we could have skipped. And I know that you're looking for a lot more than that going forward. But man, that's so remarkable to think about. And I know everybody listening is thinking in their own families, the milestones that can come in 3 years. It's really interesting stuff.
Stacey, I have to pause when I listen to you tell that story, because for me, I have only a glimpse of the burden that people living with type 1 or parents or caregivers experience. I have a glimpse because I have the privilege of stepping into the sanctity of a family and being open to hearing these things. But to your point, what is that? What does that mean to a child or to a family that you can have a delay of 2 years or 3 years or even longer than that? What does that mean? So this ability to do that, the data indicating that this can do that, can do exactly what you're talking about. It can delay to a time where kids can be more able to communicate signs of hypoglycemia. A kid in college, perhaps, delay until after college, and so on and so forth. So how do you put a measure on what that means for a family? You know, what that means, 2 years or 3 years being insulin independent. How can you describe that to someone who doesn't, quote unquote, get it, what that means to a family? So I know, just like you, from personal experience, what I've heard from my patients and their families, how much that could potentially have meant and how much that can mean to them going forward.
Oh, it really is. I was going to say it's fun to think about. I'm not sure that's the right way to say it, because in my mind, it's kind of fun because I think about how silly my son was at that age, but it is really encouraging to think about. I'm curious, are there any concerns, side effects, anything that people need to be aware of when it comes to teplizumab?
So, I think that every drug has potential risk and benefit, and we have to be fair and recognize that. However, in the data that's been published from the trial that we've been discussing, the TN10 study, it was shown that the side effects were manageable, that they were easy to address, resolved on their own. And that's consistent with all the other studies that have used teplizumab. So from our perspective, in looking at the data, we feel that it's appropriate to say, yes, there is always a risk that the side effects that were seen in any of the trials were expected and were easily manageable.
As we wait to see what the FDA will do, are you still looking for people to be in studies? My audience is always very interested in that. Are you looking for not just the screening that, the T1 detect? Are there more studies that people can take part in?
Yeah, so we currently have a study ongoing. It's a multinational study, multi-site in the U.S. called PROTECT. And this study, as opposed to the data that we've been talking about that showed you can prevent progression from stage 2 to stage 3, this is a study for people who are newly diagnosed between the ages of 8 and 17 within the first 6 weeks. And I would urge people, if they have any questions or they need any information, to reach out. And Stacey, you and I can talk about what the best way to have that information or those queries directed because when we talk to people about going online and looking at clinicaltrials.gov, it becomes a very, very difficult website to navigate. But suffice it to say that this is a trial where kids between the age of 8 and 17, newly diagnosed, are given an infusion or a placebo of Teplizumab, and they are given another dose about 6 months or a year later. Again, this is an infusion. However, it's a 12-day infusion rather than a 14-day infusion, and there are 2 infusions over the year. And in that study, we're measuring C-peptide. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, C-peptide is a measure of beta cell function. And so the most important measure for us is beyond hemoglobin A1C. How are those beta cells working? How are the residual beta cells producing insulin at this point? And how do they produce insulin after the treatment has given, as measured by what we call area under the curve of C-peptide production, the amount of C-peptide over time responding to drinking a whole lot of sugar and seeing where it is that the C-peptide is produced. I think that that's really an important piece. I also, Stacey, if I may take the liberty and talk about Prevention Bio for just a moment.
Yes, please do.
Because, and it comes back to camp a little bit, and you may wonder, like, what's the connection? When I first started at Prevention Bio, we had a town hall and, 45, 50 people, I don't remember. And the CEO, Ashley Palmer, was talking about the importance of us understanding the type 1 community. And I was like, okay, that's words, sounds good. And I said, okay, is a company dedicated to type 1? Okay, that sounds good. And so I chatted the group and I said, I'm on the board of Camp Najeta. Most of us live in the tri-state area. I'd be more than happy to host you and to have you guys paint benches and, do all kind of clean up the garbage in between sessions. And he said, that's not volunteer. That's part of your job. And I said to myself, I've worked in other companies that have been in the diabetes space. I have never heard a CEO get up and say, this is your job. It was mind blowing. And I knew then, I was in the right place, right?
Yeah.
So with that sort of as a backdrop, we are really committed to type 1. The innovation here is, I think, landmark in the fact that it will be the first disease modifying, if we get the approval, which we hope, the first therapeutic intervention in type 1 diabetes since the development of insulin, and potentially the only one that is going to be disease modifying.
Wow.
But we're not just there. And as we spoke about, we're in front of the FDA now with the hope that we'll get approval for the at-risk population. But we're also in clinical trials to see the ones who are newly diagnosed. So if, unfortunately, they've gone on to stage 3 or symptomatic, but we're also working on a vaccine for Coxsackie virus. And so Coxsackie has been thought of as a precipitating agent or an infection that could potentially provoke or create an immune response that ends up being adversely affecting the pancreas. And the crazy thing is that as a pediatrician first, we would see Coxsackie virus all the time.
Right.
But, I have the good fortune of working in a company with a lot of really smart immunologists. And I joke and I say, if I would have known immunology was so interesting, maybe I would have paid more attention in medical school. But the fact is, here's another way that we're looking at type 1 diabetes, and the commitment there to innovation is truly remarkable. And I would be remiss if I didn't have the opportunity to state that on this podcast, because I think that speaks to the motivation and it speaks to the genuine commitment to people and their caregivers living with type 1.
And you mentioned camp. And as we've mentioned a couple of times here, you are a pediatric endocrinologist. So between the two of those things, you've seen a lot of families over the years. You have probably had a lot of nervous moms and quiet dads in your office with little kids to grumpy teenagers and independent young adults. I'm curious, when you talk about something like teplizumab, and you mentioned, as you said, this could be the first disease therapy for type 1 diabetes. I know you don't have type 1 diabetes, but boy, are you part of all of those families. Can you speak a little bit about what that means to you?
Well, I often joke with people that, I would be more than happy to do anything, including working in my parents' lingerie store, than taking care of people with type 1 diabetes. Not because I hate type 1 diabetes, I do, but it's because I see what happens, what families go through. So for me, what it means to me, if we get approval, I'll feel like I finally was able to do something. When you get to the point in your career when you're working with families who have type 1 diabetes and you come to the honest realization that you can't fix it, surgeon can go in there and cut it out, but you can't fix it. And the burden really sits with the family, the grumpy teenagers who didn't ask for this, who are dealing with the intimacy issues, college issues, you name it. The high school kids who are trying to deal with all the complex issues of psychosocial adjustment to high school and body image, etc. It's unbelievable. So for me as a treating physician, anything, and it's not only teplizumab, but anything that could make them living with diabetes just a bit easier, to lift a little bit of the burden, would be incredibly meaningful to me. And that's sort of how I got into this. I was trained to make people who have type 1 diabetes feel that they're never doing a good enough job, that they're at risk of developing all these complications. And, when you get to the point in your career, you realize that not only did that not help, it hurt. And then really being in a position to hopefully be able to make a fundamental difference in how that goes down, it's really hard to articulate, I have to say.
Did your parents really own a lingerie store?
They did. Olga's Corset and Specialty Shop. 2 Eastern European immigrants who came here penniless, trying to build a life for themselves in the Golden Land.
Oh, isn't that marvelous? That's wonderful.
It sure is. It sure is. Yep. All they wanted is to see their kids, get an education. And of course, me becoming a doctor. I mean, my dad almost ran up to the podium when I got my diploma. He just couldn't contain himself. So, yeah,
I love it.
Absolutely.
All right. I think we've got everything and more.
Yeah. I mean, I would leave you, Stacey, with, if nothing else, to really, really get the word out for people to screen, for docs to really hear from their families, why don't you screen? I have another kid. That to us, and I think to the whole community, now there's potentially something that can happen. You mentioned TrialNet, and TrialNet has done an amazing job in getting teplizumab to where it is now. And they've done an amazing job at moving the screening field forward. But it's got to get out of the realm of research alone now, because now we're there. Now we're potentially at the threshold of a whole bunch of therapies that we hope will get approved. And teplizumab, hopefully, if the FDA is happy with the data and convinced that the drug is safe and effective, which we have great confidence that they will, there are others coming right behind. So the screening is so critical, Stacey.
Thank you so much for joining me. We will link up all of the information and spread the word as best we can. But thanks for explaining everything. And come on back, knock on wood, if everything goes through the FDA. Come on back and share what's next.
I would be delighted to do that.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
More information on everything we talked about at diabetes-connections.com. You can learn more about teplizumab and Provention. It's really fascinating stuff. And, it's not as easy as, one shot and you're done or one pill a day. I mean, it is, as he mentioned, an in-hospital procedure. But imagine 2 weeks of that and then 2, 3, maybe 4 years, maybe more of prevention of type 1. I mean, what an incredible beginning. I don't get my hopes up often. You know me, if you've listened for a very long time. I wouldn't say I'm cynical, but I'm certainly not running after every development. But I feel like we've been watching this one for so long. I'm almost ready to put my rose-colored glasses on. We'll see. I'll keep you posted on, what comes out of this, what the FDA decides. And, there's going to be a lot more information down the road. Up next in innovations, it is time to get cynical again. I'm going to be talking to you and bringing you some audio about a roundtable on insulin pricing. So stay tuned for that. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And when we first started with Dexcom back in December of 2013, the share and follow apps were not an option. They hadn't come out with the technology yet. So trust me when I say using share and follow apps makes a big difference. I think it's really important to talk to the person you're following or sharing with, get comfortable with how you want everyone to use the system. Even if you're following your young child, these are great conversations to have. At what numbers will you text? How long will you wait to call? That sort of thing. That way, the whole system gives everyone real peace of mind. I'll tell you what I absolutely love about Dexcom Share, and that is helping Benny with any blood glucose issues using the data from the whole day and night and not just one moment. Internet connectivity is required to access separate Dexcom Follow app. To learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Last week, a new group, or at least new to me, called Investigate Insulin Now, partnered with the American Economic Liberties Project and held a discussion about the impact of insulin pricing. I'm going to read you the description from their website. Nearly 7 million Americans suffering from diabetes need insulin to live, but a cartel of drug companies who control the production of insulin, Eli Lilly, Sanofi, and Novo Nordisk, have made the life-saving drug criminally expensive by colluding with each other to hike prices in lockstep over and over and over for years. On March 18th at 12:30 p.m., the American Economic Liberties Project and the Investigate Insulin Now campaign hosted a discussion focused on the dangerous impacts of the insulin cartel, racial inequalities in insulin access, and what Congress and the new Biden administration must do to hold these corporations accountable and address concentration in this critical industry. And that is the quote from the website. I'm going to link this up. You can watch the entire discussion. It is less than an hour, but it features Congresswoman Katie Porter, who you may recognize from her whiteboard. Many people just know her from that. But she's part of the Oversight Subcommittee on Economic and Consumer Policy. And then the remarks here are from people with the American Economic Liberties Project, T1 International, insulin advocates, the executive director of Social Security Works. So there's a lot of people talking here. I want to bring you one short clip. This is about a minute long. And this is Matt Dinger. He is a patient, as you'll hear. He is an advocate, and he is a board member at T1 International. He has just said that he doesn't know anyone who uses insulin who hasn't rationed it at one time or another. And he sets up his comments here by saying that at one point he had no insurance for just 1 month. He was switching jobs and he knew that he would have no insurance for a month. And that resulted in him rationing insulin ahead of time so he would have a stockpile, and then also rationing after he got the job and had the insurance because he knew his deductible would mean he would be paying $1,000 a month for insulin for the first few months.
I'm lucky to be in the position that I'm in. And even so, I'm a job loss away from financial ruin because the concentration of economic power when it comes to the price of insulin lies almost entirely in the hands of 3 companies. I am completely beholden to them, and I'm terrified by that every single day. Corporate concentration and monopolistic behavior by the big 3 insulin manufacturers allow them to set prices as high as possible with no fear of losing market share. This includes things like shadow pricing, which is increasing the prices in tandem with one another instead of competing to set the lowest price, pay for delay agreements, lawsuits to keep biosimilar insulins off the market, patent games to extend their product exclusivities long past when they would normally expire. As someone who has worked in healthcare for the entirety of my professional life, I understand the price of innovation. And let me tell you, leveraging anti-competitive practices in order to give your CEO a pay package of $23.7 million isn't innovative. And businesses that would do that while their consumers are dying aren't companies, they're cartels.
It's pretty powerful stuff. I'll link it up if you want to watch it again. It is less than an hour. The Investigate Insulin Now campaign is a coalition of a bunch of different organizations. And I think we're going to be hearing a lot more from them because these are some pretty big names that are backing them. And while there's a lot of hope that the new Biden administration will move on some of these, there really has been no indication from Democrats or Republicans, in my opinion, on the federal level, that we will see strong action taken. So I'll continue to keep you posted on this one as well. I can't imagine the insulin companies are going to take kindly to being called a cartel. I thought that was some very interesting language. All right, before I let you go, reminder that I will be speaking live to some JDRF folks out west tonight. That's linked up on social media and in this episode as well. And if you're listening a couple of days or weeks after this episode airs, I'd love to come to your chapter virtually or maybe in person down the road. So please reach out. We do have an event tab at diabetes-connections.com. And you can always request me to come speak, or just you can ping me anywhere, email me directly. I love talking to groups. It's always so much fun. I always learn something as well. In our classic episode this week, we're going to be talking to a Broadway performer, Maddie Trumbull. And she has played lead roles in Wicked and Newsies. And we'll check in with her and see how she's been doing. This interview was 5 years ago now. And of course, the last year has been, we've seen Broadway completely shut down. So I checked in with her and I'll let you know what she is up to in our classic episode airing in just a couple of days. Thank you, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you, as always, for listening. I'm Stacey Simms. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Simms Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.